There is one thing, Steve, that I like about what we've gone through in the past 3 years or so. I feel like it's kind of like the fulfillment of everything Star Trek predicted except for the transporters. Because like we had the cell phones going, right? And that was like the tricorders. But now we're actually like doing all these remote discussion things, right? Was that happening as much before 2019? I feel like we were all scared of Zoom. We were all scared of Teams and everything. And that, I think it kicked us over the edge.
I think you're right there. I think the whole pandemic and remote everything definitely forced us to embrace the technology for meeting.
And now we're doing it. We do it. We do it on YouTube. We do it. I mean, I do Teams meetings all the time, right? And it's just like a normal thing. So I think some good things have come out of it. We're actually going to go back and talk about COVID a little bit today, partly based on a question asked last week by our good friend Ken Spencer. Said, what's going on with the EUAs? What's going on with all the emergency use authorizations?
Well, I suppose it's a good question because just yesterday the pandemic officially ended, I believe, according to CDC.
Officially ended, yes, May 11th. And as we'll talk about today, it actually was a expiry. Like it wasn't actually so much of a declaration, which I had thought it was. When I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, they must have made a decision. But it was actually a expiration of the public health emergency that they chose not to renew. That was basically what happened. But yeah, lots to talk about today. That and more. Also today, AdvaMed talking about the EtO crisis, this time turning the tables on the EPA. That'll be fun. But all this coming up next on MedTech Crossroads. All right. I don't think we've had this slide up before, but if you want to get a hold of us on MedTech Crossroads, you can email contact@medtechcrossroads.com. If you want to get in touch with Into Being, info@intobeing.com. But if you want to talk specifically about the show or something that's happening on the show or in the news or events that your organization is having that you want us to know about, contact@medtechcrossroads.com. Let's talk about some upcoming events if we can get our clicker working. Looks like the battery's finally died. So we'll just do it this way. Upcoming events from the local and national ecosystem. We draw these from MichBio, from Ann Arbor Spark, from the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, from the MEDC, the US FDA, and Project MedTech, among others. And the first one we want to remind you of is coming up all throughout May. Save the date for AdvaMed has a whole bunch of workshops. The first one, May 15th through 17th, 510K and de novo submissions. After that, on the 18th through the 19th, an IDE submissions workshop. And then after that, on the 23rd through the 25th of May, AdvaMed is having a PMA submissions workshop. Well, one of those that actually, of a number of you, the IDE one, that catches people off guard. I gotta say, in all the folks that we work with, everyone's like, yeah, my marketing clearance. I got to be ready for my marketing clearance. And they're like, is it a 510K? Is it a de novo? Is it a PMA? What is it? Am I exempt somehow? And that's great. Like those are all really important questions to be asking. IDEs oftentimes catch people off guard because an IDE can be, if you are considered a significant risk device, it can be a boatload of work. So that's a good one to know about. And if you have any questions on all these virtual conferences, workshops rather, May 15th through 25th from AdvaMed. Let's see. Oops, that slide is old. I think you're going to miss that one. We'll move on to the next one. We're looking at May 24th in Grand Rapids, 5 to 7 p.m., the BioConnections Networking Mixer. MichBio and the West Michigan My Device Consortium are bringing this networking event to Grand Rapids. Cost is $10 unless you're a member of one of those two organizations at Thornapple Brewing in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And on May 23rd through 24th, the Midwest Growth Capital Symposium, the venerable institution that is MGCS, is coming to the Ross School of Business, a place where investors and startups congregate from all over the Midwest. I'm going to forget how many years it's been going. I think it had its 30th anniversary a few years ago. So this event has been going for quite a while. And if you happen to want to work for the FDA, the virtual hiring event, Scientific and Professional Jobs, is happening May 23rd through 25th of this year. You can scan that QR code. We're sort of phasing out the QR codes. Let me know if this has been useful to you or not. We're putting them directly on the YouTube page. So if there's something you missed, you can go back and scan the QR code, or you can just go to the hard link on the YouTube page after the fact, and you should be able to find everything right there. And on we're into June 5th through 9th, there's a virtual public meeting, Regulatory Education for Industry, the REDI annual conference. If you happen to be in regulatory affairs, it's a great event. The CDRH devices track, June 7th through 8th. Great yearly conference. I don't know who to throw under the bus for this, though. I don't know if I can. This just seems to be happenstance. Then on June 5th through 9th, we have the REDI conference. And get this. On June 5th through 7th, we have the RESI conference. Only one letter difference. Redefining early stage investments. I went to their RESI conference. I've been to both, but I went to the one in San Francisco in January for a day. This one in Boston on June 5th. A lot of investors, a lot of startups, very pitch-heavy conference. So completely different domains, but if you want to talk to startups and investors, go to Boston for the RESI conference. And if you want to talk with FDA about regulatory issues and learn all about what's going on in the regulatory world, that'd be the REDI conference, June 5th through the 9th. Also, we don't know a whole lot about this yet. Actually, we do have a little bit more information here. This FDA Science Forum. I'm going to bring up some notes here because June 13th through 14th, FDA is holding this event. We're just going to bring this up here real quick. Yeah, there is 2 days of events on this. They have a session on improving clinical and post-market evaluation, one on empowering patients and consumers, another one on advancing products based on novel technologies. That would be like breakthrough and safe programs, food and cosmetic safety, a session on tools to effectively use big data, another session on product development and manufacturing, another one on medical countermeasures, infectious disease, and pathogen reduction technologies, and a final session on substance use, misuse, and addiction. So as we told you last week, I think it was, like Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, very focused on how do you clear these kinds of things? Obviously there's divisions at FDA that are focused on doing the actual clearances, but they've got a lot of people thinking about the science behind these things and advising FDA themselves on how to approach these things. So this should be an interesting set of sessions, June 13th and 14th. Also, Dwayne and company down at Project MedTech wanted us to make sure to mention August 30th coming up in Cleveland, Ohio, the Midwest Showcase, Innovation in the Midwest. Stephen Rapundlo will be there from MichBio. Tom Shehab from Arboretum Ventures, as well as others. But that will be happening in Cleveland, Ohio in August 30th. And in September, it got moved. It was going to be in May, but the MichBio Life Sciences Showcase, September 18th in Lansing, Michigan. I know they're covering drugs and biologics and cannabis and medical devices, a whole bunch of things all at one event. And I believe those are the events for this week. We'll keep you up to date. We're into June already. The year is flying by. I don't really want that, but the weather outside is pretty cool, so I will live with that as we move over to what is happening in the news. I don't usually like to talk a lot about the FDA talking heads because oftentimes it feels like, right, somebody, especially if they're appointed, you know, they just say whatever sounds good. Is that cruel? Am I being too harsh? I've often appreciated those who are actually what you call the bureaucrats there. This is going to sound really weird. I appreciate bureaucrats. I think I just said that live on air. But the difference, as someone once explained to me, is you've got political appointees and you've got people who are going to work there no matter who is in office. You've often heard me speak of Dr. Jeff Shuren, who runs CDRH, saying he seems to be trying to do a good job there. And he is not so much an appointee as he is somebody who is going to be there no matter who's in office. Not so with Dr. Califf, who is the commissioner, but I really appreciated what he said in this National Health Council's 2023 Science for Patient Engagement Symposium, Patient Empowerment in the Digital Health Era. I was a little bit surprised because he touched on some things that we have been observing on the show, some things that we got to talk about with folks at the MedCon conference down in Ohio. And he hit them directly on the nose. This was not fluff. He really did identify the issues that are emerging. And one of the trends that kind of criticized in a recent week on the show was this idea of how people take things, especially in digital health, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, and they get really excited about them, and they talk about them, and when you say the emperor has no clothes, oftentimes they'll say, well, but we'll work on what we can. And, I mean, that's not entirely untrue, but sometimes you have to hit the direct issue square on the nose and say, can we do what we're trying to do? Are we really tackling the biggest issues? Are we really doing benefit risk the way we should be doing benefit risk? Are we really helping people, or are we rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Right? That's really the question we should be asking. And that was the tenor of Dr. Califf's talk. He was focusing on patient engagement and digital health. And he says these are important things, but he says at the same time, this convergence of these areas raises serious questions about our approach to clinical research, health, and healthcare. I could not agree more. I'm glad he's phrasing it this way. He says that we tend to be biologically and mechanistically oriented in our scientific advances. And that's true. And we've been encouraged that way because you get this idea like you just test something in isolation and you've proven something, right? And we do give lip service to the idea that a device's benefit needs to outweigh its risks, and that's a holistic kind of a thing. But it's still very easy to fall into these very narrow, short-sighted ways of saying, is this working or not? He also notes that we as a society are breaking new ground in understanding human behavior, social interactions, and how they are inextricably intertwined with health, disease, and human outcomes. Love that statement. So he's saying you can't just look at one thing and say this device is safe and effective. Now, of course, we can always ask the question, what is the regulator's job? Should the regulator be just asking very basic questions and leave it to the rest of society to figure out how it fits in? But nevertheless, there is truth being spoken here. Ultimately, the benefits and risks of the use of a product depend on whether and how it's used and the context in which it's used. Of course, we know this. This is the center of benefit risk. But he calls out a few large questions that he wanted to shed light on. I think these are worth passing on. Disparities. He talks about COVID is only part of the problem in our society, and it seems to be diminishing. But things like gun violence, suicide, opioid overdose, ongoing rise in chronic diseases, and their sequelae like stroke and heart attack. And then differences as a function of race, ethnicity, sex, education, wealth, and rural living status are stark. So there are all these indicators. And it's easy to think about a device or a product and say, hey, I measured a variable in a population and my device works. But does that effect last? Does it endure in the true population that we're getting to treat? Later on, he talks about how we're really getting to treat sort of every kind of person. We do live in a melting pot, and every kind of person does make it through the doors of our healthcare systems. This was an amazing quote here from Ed Young in The Atlantic, which Dr. Califf passed on. Technological solutions drift into society's penthouses. Wow. Diseases seep into its cracks. Oh my goodness. So again, he says, I urge you to think beyond the hypothetical or artificial laboratory-based assessment of how new drugs, devices, and foods will be used across our society. He's actually asking people not just to make devices and sell them to the rich and famous, but to actually ask, where is disease actually making it into the poorer parts of our population, which I think is a really good thing to draw attention to. Other areas he wanted to focus on: representativeness. This is where he said, we have the ability to interact with almost the entire spectrum of people with a disease or at risk. So are we really addressing the representativeness of the population when we create a device? Algorithmic bias. It is unlikely that an accurate algorithm will stay accurate when deployed in real life over time. There, straight out of the mouth of the FDA commissioner. It's going to need adjustment and measurement of its operating characteristics. How do we get that done? This will make some listeners very, very happy to hear that, only a year and a half later, the FDA commissioner is directly acknowledging this issue. Large language models. Oh, isn't AI cool? Isn't it amazing what we can do? We will quickly be swept away by something we hardly understand. This is great. I love this. He's actually saying the emperor has no clothes right from the top of FDA. And misinformation. Obviously, there's so many ways that you do have to question, is what I'm getting really the truth? So again, I don't usually pass these sorts of things on because it's usually talking heads just saying, blah, 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 we did things, right? But this is actually forward-looking, saying, here's the problems we're facing. Let's not get blinded by our fun little studies that tell us we did something when maybe the problems are bigger than we realize. Let's actually try to address those. So hat goes off there. Thought that was worth passing on. Next up, the recurring theme of ethylene oxide and the EPA. I'm going to jump ahead here to this statement, and this is a document from AdvaMed. Ethylene oxide is used to sterilize 50% or 20 billion, the grammar here is a little bit bad, of medical devices in the United States each year. As the EPA notes, ethylene oxide sterilizes an estimated 95% of all surgical kits. So its use is prevalent. What is interesting here, and as you know from us relating it previously, EPA is trying hard to reduce the amount of ethylene oxide used. The medical device industry does not inherently object to that. It's not a great chemical to have around. It would be nice to move away. There's a number of companies working on innovative solutions to this in partnership, many of them with FDA. AdvaMed, I think, is doing something kind of smart here. They're saying, look, we don't fundamentally object, but we're going to use EPA's own language to raise some questions about how quickly this is being implemented and whether or not it's a good idea. They say this, AdvaMed President and CEO Scott Whitaker says, however, EPA on one hand recognizes the challenges its proposals pose for the sterile medical technologies patients depend on. On the other hand, it dismisses or downplays the challenges. Patients can't afford for the EPA to sweep those concerns under the rug. I tell you, between the ETO thing and what's happening in Europe with MDR, I think we're going to see a lot of missing devices from the market that people are not expecting. But the EPA says these things, and AdvaMed just parrots them to make its own point. Ethylene oxide sterilization services are a critical input in the provision of safe medical devices, and there's uncertainty in how the proposal could potentially affect the medical device supply chain. Again, EPA's language, not AdvaMed's. If the capacity of the industry were to potentially decline, even temporarily, due to the proposed rule, there could be increased risk of shortages for some devices. And finally, it should be noted, however, that there are no alternative sterilization methods for a substantial portion of medical devices, and alternative modalities for highly EtO-dependent products are unlikely to be available in the near future. Now, it is the case that people are working on some really, really cool solutions out there, but this from EPA directly, I think AdvaMed is wise to call attention to this, to at least slow the process down a little bit and make sure that we don't run out of critical devices in this process. So that's the update on ethylene oxide and EPA's position and how AdvaMed is responding to that. It seems like a reasonable thing to just be asking, hey, hold on, let's make sure these devices don't go off the market. We'll make the change. We'll reduce ethylene oxide. We'll move to some really cool new technologies coming down the road. But got to do that in a safe and sane way so that we don't lose medical devices in our hospitals. Well, now we come to the main event. I feel like a boxing announcer. And after COVID, I think we all went a few rounds in the ring. You know, Steve, like you said, the public health emergency expired yesterday and wasn't renewed. And of course, you got people on both sides of that going, well, COVID's still here. Yep, COVID is still here. It never actually went away. The effects of it just seem to be diminishing. And on the other hand, you got people saying, why did we wait this long to cancel the public health emergency? You know, like any good marketing speak, we tried to throw a little bone out there in the title of this. But maybe the best one that we really should be using is the EUA is dead, long live the EUA. Because the reality here is that the public health emergency, and this whole segment was motivated by a question that our friend Ken Spencer asked last week on the show. So thank you, Ken, for motivating us to go back and look at this. It was very timely given the May 11th expiry of the public health emergency. But it basically comes down to this. The public health emergency and the EUAs are not the same thing. Okay? They exist independently of each other. And as we'll remind you, EUAs are nothing new. They've been around for a while. But before we talk directly about the public health emergency or the EUAs, I want to remind you of this thing that we have talked about before, which is the FDA's device shortage list, talking about the supply of medical devices. And this list that the FDA has maintained is based on the Section 506J. Make sure you use that in your weekend conversation. Yeah, I was listening to a show about Section 506J. 506J required manufacturers of certain devices to notify the FDA of a permanent discontinuance or interruption in the manufacture of a device that is likely to lead to a meaningful disruption in the domestic supply of the device related to a public health emergency. So this one does relate to the public health emergency. And it was mandatory. You had to report. If your device type was one that the FDA was interested in, you had to report it during the public health emergency. But this authority, it only extends before and during a public health emergency, not after. FDA has the authority to receive voluntary notifications from manufacturers. I'm not sure who really wants to report extra things to FDA. But there's no longer a mandate to report things under Section 506J. So this document mostly has to do with how do I submit voluntary 506J notifications. FDA decides what devices are in shortage by sort of staring at things, looking at the national stockpile. They are removing devices from the device shortage list. They have decided to remove medical gloves, surgical respirators, medical gowns, surgical masks. All these things have been removed. Not everything has been removed. But what does the removal of the public health emergency mean in light of this Section 506J? Well, it means that no one is mandated to report anything anymore, which means that device shortage list is basically, as far as we can tell, going to go defunct really fast. What are we watching here? What are we watching happen? Okay, this is opinion, folks. This is not anything from FDA. This is not anything from Intubing. This is just Gene's opinion. When we started the webinar early on and we were focused exclusively on COVID, we talked about what a shame it was that we weren't more prepared as a society, that we didn't anticipate these things. And then we discovered that ventilator designs had been created that were government funded, that had been lost in the sands of time. Quite a bit of money was spent on developing a low-cost $3,000 ventilator that was shelved. I forget which one was it. Maybe Steve, you remember, was it swine flu or something like that when they had developed that ventilator?
I am not sure offhand there.
Yeah, it's been 2 years since we were talking about that. But it got the design got bought by a company that shelved it, and eventually there was no availability. Then COVID comes along and we're like, hey, didn't we pay for a design for a ventilator? And the answer is yup, but it wasn't maintained. So I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus here, but I think what we're watching is the phenomena of what happened previously. There's not the willpower to look back and look forward, right? A device shortage list would be a really good thing to have around, to really know what's in that stockpile. But that's not something that I think the willpower is going to be there for. So you're watching this drop away kind of quietly. And I'm not advocating and saying that we should or shouldn't do any particular thing. That's not my place. But I think what you're watching is the knowledge of what we have disappearing because the urgency isn't there. That's what's happened before. It's what happened in 2010 when the previous ventilator was developed. It just sort of dropped away. And so unfortunately, while FDA could ramp back up their scrutiny and put 506J back in and say, hey, we see something emerging on the other side of the world, how many respirators do we have? Right now, that doesn't appear to be happening. So, this may be something that's worth talking about more as a society. I don't know if someone will hear this and say, wow, we should really do something about that. Again, it's got to be a balance. It's got to be something where you can afford to spend that effort. And nevertheless, if you're making things like personal protective equipment or certain types of other devices, maybe it is worth your while to stay in front of FDA and let them know that I do have these things available, so that if something happens, and that's still a possibility, voluntary 506J submissions for medical device manufacturers, still a thing. So you can go do it if you want to keep in front of FDA and say, hey, we do have these here. And then if a public health emergency comes up, they know immediately where they can get them. Well, speaking of public health emergencies and EUAs, we told you a minute ago that EUAs are dissociated from public health emergencies. That was not always immediately obvious to me that these things were separate. Here's a webpage we haven't seen in a couple of years. This is the EUA webpage at fda.gov. And the first thing I just want to note here is there's this thing called the PrEP Act that has come out. We're going to come over here to the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act, several declarations. I think we're on the 11th modification of the PrEP Act, but basically, and I'm not going to belabor this, it's to provide liability immunity for activities related to medical countermeasures against COVID-19. They want to protect people from having tried their best, who have tried their best, give them immunity, and that makes sense. So the PrEP Act is there. If you're interested in what that immunity looks like, you can go study the PrEP Act, which was just updated on May 9th, the 11th amendment to that. But also guidance documents surrounding emergency use authorizations being updated and oftentimes removed. We're going to dive in on those EUAs and also exemptions. But before that, I want to remind you, EUAs are nothing new. There are EUAs coming out on monkeypox, right? That's a thing. And then if we keep on scrolling over here, we're going to find names that we haven't seen in a while. Anthrax, Ebola, H7N9, Middle East MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, Zika virus. There were EUAs issued on all of these. Not all of them are necessarily active, although it looks like some of them may still be. That's interesting. So EUAs themselves are nothing new. They've been around for a while, and they are apparently a good way to control things, and that makes sense. So what happens when the public health emergency is over? What happens? And this was kind of the question that our friend Ken Spencer asked the other week. How do these things relate, first of all? Talk about the public health emergency itself, right? This is the public health emergency, not the EUA. A declaration generally lasts for 90 days, but may be extended. Well, that one was extended quite a few time periods, and just now expired on the 11th of May. But the public health emergency declaration isn't what gives FDA the authority to issue an emergency use authorization. So what it does is it allows the government to make grants, enter into contracts, investigations into the cause, treatment, or prevention of the disease or disorder. That's what the public health emergency does. EUAs are separate declarations, and they persist until terminated. So here's the fundamental question, or answer to the question asked last week. EUAs persist until they're canceled fundamentally. And it may remain in effect beyond the duration of the public health emergency declaration. So where have we seen EUAs? Well, we've seen them with regard to in vitro diagnostics, personal respiratory protective devices, medical devices and alternative products used as medical devices, and then drugs and biological products. That's the areas where we've seen EUA issuances. When an EUA finally gets terminated or revoked, there's going to be transition period. Don't worry, there will be transition period. There is transition period. We're into some of that transition period now. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so, yeah, we're going to talk about this here in a second. We're going to go through what happens to both guidance documents that were granting exemptions, not even EUAs, like just, hey, you know what, as long as we're here, let's do it this way kind of stuff. Those are leaving. And even, there's a whole bunch of guidance documents even beyond that are in various states of flux. In fact, just show you this one page here. These are the now 56. These are being reduced. 56 guidance documents remaining for COVID-19. So if you search like COVID-19 guidance documents or go to the links on YouTube, if you want to know what guidances are still in effect, you can find that out there. But what happens if I have a device? And I've heard from so many companies, man, it was like so many people jumped on the bandwagon, tried to help, tried to do things, make tests, make masks, et cetera, and oftentimes that was well rewarded at the time. But as we heard just the other week, Thermo Fisher, I think, was the company that, like many others, had just had a whole bunch of layoffs because they don't expect the need for the tests that were being used so widely. And so we're seeing a lot of pullback from devices and tests related to COVID. So what's the transition plan? This is the transition plan for medical devices that fall within enforcement policies. What does that mean? Well, when you hear enforcement at FDA, you have to think we're ignoring the rules. Is that a harsh way to say it? I mean, that's kind of what it is. What we're saying is we're not changing the rules. We're not establishing new rules. We're just going to enforce what exists differently than we normally would. Okay? So this is a little bit of look the other way and squint kind of stuff going on. And if we come over here, here's list 1. Things that did not receive emergency use authorizations. Digital pathology devices, imaging systems, non-invasive fetal and maternal monitoring, telethermographic systems, digital health devices for psychiatric disorders, ECMO, remote ophthalmic assessment and monitoring devices. I guess you didn't want to be staring in your eye doctor's face 8 inches away right during the height of COVID. That made sense. Infusion pumps and accessories, face shields, surgical masks and respirators, gowns, gloves, sterilizers, disinfectant devices, air purifiers, ventilators, molecular influenza and RSV tests, coagulation systems for measurement of viscoelastic properties. I wonder if that had to do with some of the blood changes that people were seeing. I don't remember that from a couple years ago. And then viral transport media for testing. So FDA basically made guidances, not emergency use authorizations, to talk about their enforcement policies for these different device classes. And those are now transitioning away. So if any of those things that I just recited and highlighted in green reminds you of anything that a company you know is working on or has been working on or has been getting a boost from selling during COVID under some kind of enforcement discretion, things are changing as of yesterday. It's a phased transition plan for the guidances in List 1. So if any of those things kind of hit something in your brain, oh, I know a company that works on that, make sure that they're thinking about this. Now, when they wrote this guidance, they knew what the date was going to be, and they were pretty sure it wasn't going to get extended again. Notice this. The implementation date is the date the COVID-19 Section Public Health Emergency Declaration expires, or 45 days thereafter, but you know what? It's not going to be that. They said, we think it's going to be May 11th. Oh, look, it was May 11th. The guidance documents identified in List 1 will no longer be in effect after the 180-day transition period ends or after November 7th, 2023. So if you know a company that is selling under these exemptions, November 7th is the likely date when that's not going to be a thing anymore. But other things need to be done before then. They have some phases. Starting yesterday, Phase 1 begins because the public health emergency is over. August 9th, Phase 2 begins, and November 7th, Phase 3 begins, and you're not selling things under these exemptions anymore, or enforcement discretions. So right now, if anyone is selling under these, you have to start following 21 CFR Part 803, Adverse Event Reporting, even if you continue to distribute under this. 90 days after the implementation date, that was that August date we talked about, you have to start following Part 806, corrections and removal requirements, and 807, registration and listing requirements, starting in August, if you plan to continue distribution after Phase 2. But Phase 3, November, not going to be distributing anymore, unless you have made a marketing submission and been submitted and accepted by the FDA. That's an option. That's still an option. You can get those in there. They have guidance on what to do for devices not distributed after Phase 2. They don't mind if objects that are out there are still used. You just can't distribute new ones. If they're single use, non-life supporting, it's basically if they're relatively safe and not going to hurt anybody, they can stay on the shelves. But if not, you're going to have to get them back. And what I really wanted to point out to you here, let's find it here. So you're going to have to register and list during Phase 2. They also want to see a notification of intent if you're a life-supporting or life-sustaining device within the scope of this guidance. Anesthesia machines, portable oxygen generators, respiratory gas humidifiers, high-flow humidified oxygen delivery devices, ventilators. These actually need a separate notification of intent if you're going to keep going with these. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. That was an incorrect statement. About whether or not they intend to submit a marketing submission. So if it's out there You need to tell the FDA if you're going to keep going with it or not. So we get to phase 3. You got to have a marketing submission in if you want to keep going in phase 3. But what happens, here's the gotcha. Is there any way to distribute an enforcement discretion device after the start of phase 3 on November 7th, 2023? Had to get excited about that because otherwise that date doesn't seem all that exciting. Yes, there is one way. There is one way that you might be distributing devices after that date, and it's if you have submitted a marketing submission to FDA and it's accepted before the start of phase 3 and they haven't decided yet. So you could be distributing into December if they haven't made a decision on it. But if they have, it goes one of two ways. Either they say, yep, you've got your clearance, congratulations, and you can now distribute it as a fully cleared medical device, or nope, in which case you are out, you're out on the street with that device, and it needs to be pulled off the market. They've got a bunch of examples in this guidance document, and these are interesting if you are under one of these situations and you wonder, does my device, where does it fit? It's not under an EUA, but it's under enforcement discretion. A lot of good examples here that you can go through. I will not simply read them to you here, because we want to go on to the EUAs themselves. But before we go there, here's a quick table from the FDA just showing phase 1 at 0 days starting May 11th, 2023, 90 days after August 9th, 2023, 180 days after November 7th. That's the date when none of this is going to be happening anymore. But there are other things you got to do if you're going to even keep up to the end of phase 2, so don't miss those. So what if it's an EUA? What if you have an emergency use authorization and you want to keep going? Well, we already said that the public health emergency isn't what creates the EUA. All right? The EUA exists because of the declaration of the EUA, and it can continue after the end of the public health emergency. So what's the transition plan for EUAs? Well, basically, until they get pulled, they're good. And in fact, there were some EUAs being issued right up until February of this year. So those have not gone away. We're going to skip over a whole bunch of this, but there's also a requirement for notification of intent. If you have an EUA for any of these types of devices, you still need a notification of intent. Hey, FDA, we're going to pull this from the market. Hey, FDA, we are going to keep this on the market and submit a marketing submission to you. Mostly anesthesia machines, ventilators, and gas humidifiers or delivery devices. So skipping ahead here just a little bit, there's one section I wanted to get to. Like the enforcement discretion, FDA does not intend to object to the disposition and use of already distributed devices, right? i.e., FDA does not intend to request market removal. You don't have to recall these devices, as long as they fit into this single-use, non-life supporting, reusable, non-life supporting or devices, if they are sort of life-supporting, that have been restored to a FDA-cleared status. Like if you have a really expensive device and it was modified for an EUA and sold not up to snuff, yeah, got to take it back and restore it to its cleared status. And it's very similar here. If you haven't submitted a marketing submission and had it accepted by FDA before the EUA termination date, let me rephrase that. If you haven't submitted a marketing submission, 510K, de novo, and got it into FDA before the EUA was canceled, or you get a negative decision to that marketing submission, then you have to discontinue the distribution of a device. But if you're in, you can wait. Like if the EUA gets canceled, but you have a marketing submission with FDA, they're not going to object to it staying out there. Laboratory developed tests are generally under enforcement discretion. And of course, LDTs are a thing unto themselves anyways, beyond the scope of this. There are also examples in this document for if you had a surgical mask here, a continuous ventilator, lots of different molecular test kit, and so on. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. But also you can read these guidance documents. They're linked in the final YouTube video that is going up right now. So if you click over to YouTube, you can find the links, hopefully for all of these, and we'll make sure they're up there for you to take a look at. But in answer to the question, what's going on with the EUAs? The EUA is dead. Long live the EUA. It's not quite a true statement. The EUAs are not dead. The PHE, the public health emergency, is gone. But the emergency use authorizations themselves continue to remain in force and will for as long as the FDA deems it to be wise. But as we said earlier, this whole medical device shortage list, something just seems sort of short-sighted about this. I don't know what else you would do. This is armchair quarterbacking, right? But the fact that we were all asking, what are we going to do? Where are we going to get ventilators and masks and everything else during the public health emergency, especially the early days of it? Well, what are we actually going to do going forward? I think that's something that needs to be talked about, and I'm hoping that maybe some of this could spark that conversation in the right circles. So we'll take just a look here to see if there's any questions or comments in Zoom and in YouTube. That is our show for today. We're thankful that you joined us. Hopefully we answered some of your questions. Do hope that if your company is working on an EUA or a enforcement situation, that you can maintain your operations, get that clearance, get out there on the market in the long-term sort of a way, so that you're not cut off from what needs to happen. We're just checking things here to see if any other comments or questions. See our friends there, but no questions at the moment. So with that, I want to thank you for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. It's always good to be with you every Friday at 2 p.m. I hope you're enjoying the new indexing that's happening for past episodes. That is starting to work backwards. The chapters are now, it must be like 10 or 12 chapters per episode, which allows you to find things more easily. So if there was something that you missed, you're going to start to see those chapters rolling out on YouTube so you can find them. And then we're able to push those forward again and remind you of cool things that have happened over the last 146 episodes of this show. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you for being with us today. Have a great day.